He had never heard a gunshot, never heard a man beg for his life, never heard his own name whispered in fear across the dark corners of Seoul's underworld. And yet, Lee Jae-won was the most feared man in the entire city, maybe in the entire country. The kind of man that politicians pretended not to know in public and called privately at midnight. The kind of man whose name made grown men go quiet mid-sentence. The kind of man who had built an empire so vast, so terrifying, so untouchable, entirely in silence. He was born deaf. And nobody outside his innermost circle knew it. The J1 syndicate controlled underground gambling rings, smuggling routes from Busan to Incheon, and enough political blackmail material to bring down half the National Assembly. At 38 years old, Lee Jae-won sat at the top of all of it. Alone. Always alone. His personal interpreter, a sharp and silent man named Soo-han, followed him everywhere, relaying the spoken word through rapid hand signs that Jae-won read the way other men read newspapers. Effortlessly. Without expression. And if Soo-han was not available, Jae-won read lips. He was terrifyingly good at it. He had watched men lie to his face, read the deception in the shape of their mouths before the words even finished forming, and responded with a single hand gesture that ended careers. Sometimes more than careers. If you are new here, welcome. And before we go any further, we have a goal. We are trying to reach 1,000 subscribers and we cannot do it without you. If this story moves you even a little, please hit the like button right now and subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. It costs you nothing and it means everything to us. Now, let's get back to J1. Because trust me, this story is about to go somewhere you are not ready for. His mansion sat on the high slopes of Bukhansan, cold and grey and enormous, like the man himself. The staff moved through it in careful silence. Nobody played music. Nobody laughed too loud. The televisions ran on mute with subtitles rolling across the screen. The house had simply adjusted itself around his world without anyone ever being asked to. Fear had a way of making people very, very considerate. But at night, when the staff had retreated and Soo-han had been dismissed and the guards had rotated to the outer perimeter, Lee Jae-won became someone else entirely. He would sit at the floor-to-ceiling window of his private study, one glass of whiskey in his hand, and press his other palm flat against the cold glass. Below, the city pulsed and glittered. He could see people on the street, laughing, arguing, a young couple kissing under a pojangmaka canopy, a street musician bent over a guitar with his eyes closed and his whole body moving with something that looked like joy. Jae-won would watch the musician and feel the faintest vibration through the glass. Not sound. Just echo. Just the ghost of sound pressing against his palm like it was trying to reach him and couldn't quite make it. He had a journal. Old, leather-bound, its pages thick with years of careful handwriting. The entry from the week before the maid arrived read, "I wonder what rain sounds like. I have stood in it 100 times and felt it on my skin and watched other people tilt their heads back and smile at it like it is saying something to them. I wonder what it is saying. I wonder if I would be a different man if I had ever heard my own name." He closed the journal. Returned to stone. Lee Jae-won was very good at returning to stone. It was Mrs. Yoon, the head housekeeper, a small sharp woman in her 60s who had somehow survived 12 years in that house through a combination of efficiency and careful invisibility, who brought the news that their third maid of the year had resigned. She stood in the doorway of his study with her hands folded and her face professionally blank and waited while he read the note she had slid across the desk. He looked up at her. His expression said, "Handle it." She bowed and left. The staffing agency called back the following afternoon with a tone in their voice that suggested they were not entirely confident in their offering. Their best available candidate, they explained, was a foreign national. Ghanaian. Her Korean was functional but limited. She had references. She had a work permit. She had, the agency added somewhat awkwardly, a very good attitude. Mrs. Yoon said fine. Jae-won was not consulted. He would not have cared anyway. Or so everyone believed. The woman who walked through the iron gates of the Bukhansan mansion on a grey Tuesday morning was not what Mrs. Yoon had expected, though she would have been hard-pressed to say exactly what she had expected. Amelia was 30 years old, quietly beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with effort, and she carried herself with a stillness that was unusual in someone walking into a house that had made 3 other people quit within weeks. She had 2 bags and a worn wooden box held against her chest with both arms, the way you carry something that matters. Mrs. Yoon gave her the full tour and the full rules. Do not enter his private study uninvited. Do not initiate conversation with the boss. Do not ask questions about the household structure. Do not make phone calls in common areas. Keep the wooden box and whatever was in it confined to her private quarters. Amelia listened to all of it without interrupting, nodding once at each rule, her eyes moving through each room with calm, steady attention. She noticed things on that first tour that she did not mention. She noticed that every television in the house was set to display subtitles by default. She noticed that the intercom system between rooms communicated by flashing light rather than tone. She noticed that the kitchen staff communicated with each other in half whispers that had nothing to do with the quiet required for a sleeping household. It was daytime, the boss was awake, and everything to do with a habit formed around someone who could not hear them anyway. She noticed that the single large speaker system built into the living room wall was dusty in a way that suggested it had not been used in a very long time. She said nothing. She put her bags in her room, placed the wooden box carefully on the shelf above her bed, and went to begin her first day of work. The confirmation came that afternoon. She was carrying a tray of tea to the study when one of the junior staff members behind her lost grip of a heavy ceramic pot, and it hit the marble floor with a crack like a gunshot. Everyone in the hallway startled. One young woman grabbed the wall. Amelia herself flinched and spun around. And at the desk 10 feet ahead of her, behind the partially open study door, Lee Jae-won did not move. Not a flicker. Not a blink. He continued reading the document in front of him, as though the world had not just split open behind him. Amelia turned back to the hallway, set the tray down on the side table, and stood very still for a moment with her hand pressed flat against the wall, and in a voice so quiet that nobody heard her, she whispered the words her grandmother had taught her before she could walk. Auntie Wee. He hears nothing. Then she picked up the tray and walked into the study and set the tea beside him and left without a word. But something had changed in her chest. Something her grandmother had put there years ago in a village in Kumasi had just woken up and was not going to let her rest. That night Amelia opened the wooden box. Inside were small wrapped bundles of dried roots and bark, 3 dark glass vials of oil, a folded cloth pouch of ground powder the color of red earth, and a small notebook in her grandmother's handwriting. She lifted out the notebook and found the page she was looking for. Nkiinkium root. Sensory neural nerve deafness. The preparation instructions covered 2 pages in her grandmother's careful looping script, the Chui and English mixed together the way her grandmother always wrote, the way her mind always worked. At the bottom of the second page, underlined twice, the heart of the healer must be clean. This is not optional. Amelia had been in that house 4 hours. She read the instructions twice and then closed the notebook and lay on her back on the bed and stared at the ceiling for a long time. She thought about the boy from her village whose name was Kofi and who had been deaf from birth and who her grandmother had healed when Amelia was 7 years old. She thought about Kofi's mother on her knees in the dirt outside their door. She thought about Lee Jae-won pressing a palm against a cold window in a dark study in a house full of people and being completely alone in a way that had nothing to do with company. She thought about the music box she had noticed on the shelf above his desk. Small, antique, a tiny dancer frozen mid-spin under a glass dome. She got up, lit her small lamp, and began to prepare. 3 weeks passed. She was careful. She watched his patterns the way her grandmother had taught her to watch. Not with impatience, not with agenda, but with open attention, the way you watch water to understand its current before you step in. Every evening at 8 o'clock, Lee Jae-won sat alone at his desk. No guards inside. No Suhon. 30 minutes of solitude that was the only softness in his entire day. She learned his tea preference, his paper preference, the exact way he liked the blinds angled in the afternoon. She became invisible in the way good healers learn to become invisible, present without pressure, seen without being a disturbance. And during those 3 weeks she watched him in the small unguarded moments he did not know anyone was seeing. She saw him stand in the garden during a rainstorm with his face turned upward. She saw him place his hand on the wall near the kitchen when Mrs. Yoon was humming to herself inside. She saw him on a quiet Sunday afternoon when the house was nearly empty, take the music box from the shelf and open it and watch the tiny dancer spin and then press the base of it slowly against his jaw and close his eyes. He stood like that for almost a minute. In the garden below the study window, Amelia watched him through the glass and felt something in her chest pull so tight it was almost pain. She turned away, went to her room, took out the vial of Nkiinkium oil that she had finished preparing 3 days earlier, held it in her palm. It was warm. It was always warm, her grandmother had told her, when the preparation was right and the healer's intention was clean. She said, "Tomorrow." The following evening at 8:04, Amelia walked into the study with the evening tea. It was routine. She had done it every night for 3 weeks. Jae-won was at his desk, back to the door, a file open in front of him. She set the tea down on the left side of the desk as always. Saucer straight. Steam rising. She reached into her apron pocket and her fingers closed around the small warm vial. She had perhaps 30 seconds before the routine became unusual. She moved behind him. Her feet made no sound on the study floor. He did not turn. He was reading. She reached up slowly, the compress already prepared and wrapped around the vial, and with a steadiness in her hand that she would later say was not hers but her grandmother's, she placed it gently against his ear and released 1 drop of warm dark oil. She stepped back. The room changed. Lee Jae-won's hand stopped moving mid-page. The document in front of him became irrelevant. Everything became irrelevant. He sat completely still, and the stillness was different from the stillness that the staff feared. That was a controlled stillness, a deliberate weapon. This was something else. This was a man who had just had the floor pulled out from under him, and had not yet fallen because he did not yet understand what was happening. 3 seconds passed. Then 5. Then 10. His shoulders, which had been squared and held high since he was a boy who decided early that the world would not see him struggle, began, slowly and without his permission, to drop. His breathing changed. It deepened. It slowed. His chest rose and fell like a man surfacing from water. And then he turned around. Amelia was standing 2 feet behind him, her hands folded in front of her apron, her face completely calm in the way that only people who have been genuinely prepared for a moment can be calm. His eyes, dark and unreadable and practiced in revealing nothing, were wide open. She had never seen them wide open before. They made him look younger. They made him look like someone she recognized even though she had never met him before this house. He looked at her. Then at the wall beside her. Then at the ceiling. His lips parted slightly. His head turned, slowly, toward the window. And then toward the clock on the wall above the bookshelf. A simple round clock, white face, black hands, that had been ticking in that study for years without ever mattering to anyone inside it. His voice, when it came, was rough and low and barely held together. The voice of someone who used it rarely and carefully and mostly in private. Who had taught himself to produce sound without being able to monitor it, who spoke the way you speak when you have never been sure if what you are producing sounds like anything at all. He said, "What is that sound?" Amelia looked at the clock, then back at him. And she said, "That is time, sir." It was always there. He stared at her. Something moved across his face that she could not name. It was too large and too fast and had too many things in it at once. His jaw tightened. His eyes went bright in a way that a man like Lee Jae-won would never in his life have permitted in front of another person if he had seen it coming. He opened his mouth and then closed it and then turned back to face his desk. Amelia bowed once and walked out of the study and closed the door behind her and stood in the hallway with her back against the wall and both hands pressed over her heart and breathed. Inside the study, Lee Jae-won sat alone and the world was enormous and loud and overwhelming and extraordinary and terrifying all at once. The hum of the refrigerator down the hall. The whisper of wind finding a gap somewhere in the window frame. Distant traffic rising from the mountain road below. His own blood moving through his body in a sound he had no word for because he had never heard it before. He pressed both hands over his ears and the pressure changed everything, and when he took them away it rushed back in. He slammed his palm flat on the desk, and the crack of it made him pull his hand back like he had been burned. He stared at his hand. He looked at the desk. He did it again, slower this time, and listened to the sound of his own impact on solid wood, and something broke open in his chest and came out as a single short laugh, startled and disbelieving and raw and nothing like the careful controlled sounds he permitted himself in company. Then his expression closed. His jaw set. His eyes went dark and still. He picked up his phone and sent a message to Suhan that read, "Bring the new maid to me. Midnight." She arrived with 2 guards flanking her and the kind of composure that made the guards feel, obscurely, that they were the ones being escorted. She stood before his desk in the yellow lamplight and met his eyes without lowering hers and waited. He did not write. He did not sign. He spoke. And the effort of it was visible, the way it costs something to use a muscle you have never properly trained, but he did it deliberately, the way he did everything deliberately. He said, "You had no right." She said, "No. I did not. I did it anyway." He said, "Why?" She held his gaze. And then she said, "Because my grandmother taught me that healing is never about permission. It is about responsibility. I saw your pain. I had the remedy. What kind of healer walks past that and does nothing? Not the kind my grandmother raised." The room was very quiet. The guards were the kind of professionally still that meant they were desperately hoping not to be noticed. J1 said, "It may not last." It was not a question. He had understood more than she had said. She said, "No, it may not. I need 3 more treatments over the next 30 days. Administered correctly, the hearing could become permanent. Without them, it will begin to fade within 72 hours. He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that one of the guards shifted his weight and then regretted it. Then J1 said, "You will stay. You will finish what you started." It was not a thank you. Lee J1 had not thanked anyone for anything in longer than he could remember. But Amelia heard what was underneath it, the thing he was not built to say directly, the thing that lived in the space between his words, and she nodded once and said, "Yes, sir." And that was enough. She was almost at the door when he said, "What is your name?" Not J1's voice now, but something quieter, something underneath J1 that she suspected very few people had ever been allowed to hear. She turned. She said, "Amelia." He said it back. Just once. The way you say a word when you are testing whether your mouth knows how to hold it. She left. He sat in the study alone for a very long time and listened to the clock tick. If you are still with us, and we know you are because this story has you and you know it, please subscribe right now if you have not already and leave a comment below telling us what you felt in that midnight scene. Your support is what keeps these stories coming. Now stay with us. Because it is about to get much more dangerous. Kwame had worked for Lee J1 for 9 years. He had started as a junior guard, worked his way up through loyalty and a talent for anticipating trouble, and had become the head of household security through a combination of competence and the kind of devotion that looks like love but is mostly about proximity to power. He was not a cruel man, but he was a careful one. And something about the maid from Ghana had been making him careful in a way that kept him up at night. He had watched her for 3 weeks. The way she moved through the house like she belonged there when she had arrived with nothing. The way she watched the boss, not with the carefully averted eyes of the rest of the staff but with direct open attention that should have gotten her dismissed on day 1. The way the boss, who had in 9 years never once deviated from his patterns, had begun in small ways to change. He paused in corridors now. He stood at open windows instead of closed ones. He had twice been caught by Kwame's security footage simply sitting in the garden doing nothing, which was so out of character it had made Kwame review the footage 3 times to confirm it was real. And now the midnight summons. And now she walked out of that meeting without consequence. And now she was to remain. Kwame gathered his 2 most trusted lieutenants in the security office, and he spoke quietly and directly. He said, "The woman is changing him. A foreign maid with powders and oils that nobody has checked, that nobody has tested, that she brought into this house in a box that she guards like it contains something valuable. She is either poisoning him or she has some kind of hold on him. Either way, she is a threat to this house and to everything we have built here. She has to go." They moved 3 nights later. Quietly. Professionally. While Amelia slept, 2 men entered her room, found the wooden box on the shelf above her bed, and were gone in under 4 minutes. Amelia woke at 5 in the morning the way healers wake when something is wrong, suddenly and completely, without the gradual surfacing of normal sleep. She sat up, looked at the shelf, stood up and walked to it and ran her hands across the empty space and stood there in the dark with her hands at her sides and her mind moving very fast and very clearly. She dressed. She did not eat. She did not tell Mrs. Yoon. She did not send a message or knock on a door or follow any of the protocols she had been given on her first day. She walked directly to Jae-won's private office at 5:40 in the morning and she opened the door and she walked in. He was already awake. He was almost always already awake. He looked up from the desk and something shifted in his face. Not alarm, not anger, but a sharpened attention that meant he was reading the situation through her body before she said a word. She said, "Your men took my box last night. Without the remaining treatments your hearing will begin to fade within 72 hours. I need it returned." He looked at her for a long moment. She did not look away. She did not explain further. She did not apologize for entering without permission or for the hour or for the directness of it. She stood before him the way her grandmother had always stood before village elders. Not small, not aggressive, simply present and clear. He picked up his phone. He made 1 call. He spoke 4 sentences. He set the phone down. He looked at her and said, "It will be returned within the hour. You will find it on your shelf." She said, "And the men who took it?" He said, "They are no longer your concern." She held his gaze for 1 more moment and then she nodded and turned to leave. At the door she paused. Without turning around she said, "You trusted me just now without asking any questions." He was quiet. Then he said, "Yes." She said, "That is the first time you have trusted anyone in a very long time, I think." He did not answer. But he did not deny it either. She left. The box was on her shelf when she returned to her room. Kwame and both lieutenants were removed from the property by 7 in the morning, and none of them ever came back. The remaining treatments passed in a quiet that was different from the silence that had defined the house before Amelia arrived. It was not the silence of fear or isolation. It was the silence of 2 people who had moved past the need to perform anything for each other, and could simply be in the same room without armor. She would arrive at 8 with the tea and the treatment, and he would set down whatever he was doing without being asked, and she would work, and they would sometimes talk and sometimes not, and both were equally comfortable. He asked her once about her grandmother. She talked for 40 minutes, and he listened without interrupting, which was notable because Lee Jae-won famously had no patience for long conversations. She told him about the village in Kumasi and the wooden table where Nana Adwoa prepared her remedies before sunrise, and the way people came from 3 villages over and sat outside the door and waited. She told him about being 7 years old and watching Kofi, the deaf boy, hear his mother's voice for the first time and not understanding what had happened until Kofi turned around with a face that looked like it had been broken open and put back together as something better. Jae-won listened to all of it. Then he said, "Your grandmother sounds like someone who was never afraid of anything." Amelia smiled and said, "She was afraid of many things. She was afraid of dogs. She was afraid of her own mother. She was afraid of failing the people who needed her. But she did the work anyway because she said fear is just information. It tells you what matters. It does not tell you to stop." He was quiet after that. But it was the kind of quiet that meant something had landed. On day 30, Amelia completed the final treatment in the evening light of his study. When she closed the box she said, "It is done. The hearing should hold." He said, "Should." She said, "Should. I am a healer, not a prophet. But the signs are good. My grandmother would be satisfied." He looked at the box in her hands. Then at her. He said, "What happens to you now?" And the question was too careful, too deliberate, too stripped of his usual bluntness to be casual. She heard what was underneath it. She said, "I go back to looking for work, I suppose. My visa situation is still complicated. But I will manage. I always have." He said nothing for a moment. Then, "You came here with nothing." And you spent your time here healing someone who gave you no reason to. She said, you gave me a reason. You just did not know you were doing it. She went to her room that night and sat on the edge of her bed and held the wooden box and let herself feel all the things she had been too focused to feel for 30 days. The fear of those first nights. The grief of being so far from home with no certainty. The weight of carrying her grandmother's gift in a world that mostly did not believe in it. She sat with all of it and then she put it down and went to sleep deeply for the first time in months. The next morning Mrs. Yoon knocked on her door and handed her an envelope without expression. Inside was a formal employment contract, not for a maid but for a position titled Head of Household Wellness. A visa sponsorship letter bearing the official seal of the J1 corporate entity. A monthly stipend that made her go still for a moment. A budget line for herbal supplies and equipment. And at the very bottom, on a plain slip of paper in handwriting she recognized, your grandmother's medicine deserves a proper place in this world. So do you. J.W. Amelia read it twice, folded it carefully, pressed it flat against her chest with both palms and closed her eyes and said something quietly in Chui that was meant for her grandmother and nobody else. That evening Lee Jae-won stood at his open window. The window was open, not pressed against, not watched through like a barrier between him and a world he could feel but not enter. Open. Seoul rose up to meet him in full. Traffic moving through the mountain roads below, someone laughing loudly in a courtyard he could not see, the wet smell of rain coming and underneath it, somewhere down on the street, a guitar. He stood very still and listened to the guitar and it was nothing like he had imagined it would be. It was better. It was more complicated and more simple at the same time. It went straight through him the way he had watched it go through other people his entire life without understanding how. The rain arrived. He did not step back. He lifted his face slightly and closed his eyes and listened to rain for the first time in 38 years of living in it, and the sound was gentle and it was sharp and it was saying something he could not quite translate, and it was the most extraordinary thing he had ever experienced, and he stood there until he was wet and did not care at all. From the hallway behind him, not knowing that he could hear her, not knowing that he had been listening for her footsteps since she left him that afternoon, Amelia hummed. It was a Ghanaian lullaby, old and slow and warm, the one her grandmother had hummed over the preparation table every morning before sunrise, the melody that lived so deep in Amelia's chest that it came out without thought, the way breathing comes out, the way home comes out. J1 did not turn around. He did not speak. He stood at his open window with the rain on his face and Seoul in his ears and the sound of her behind him, and he smiled. A real smile, the kind that doesn't know it's happening, the kind that has nothing to perform and nowhere to be except exactly where it is. And he listened. If this story moved you, please do not leave without subscribing, liking this video, and dropping a comment below. Tell us, what was the moment that got you? Was it the clock? The midnight confrontation? The envelope? We read every single comment and they keep us going. Share this video with someone who loves a good story and help us reach 1,000 subscribers. We are building something here and we need you in it. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next one.